going to go ahead and get started. I'm sure people will be trickling in, but we're going to get started with the next session. It's going to be Build One, Deploy Many. And Luke from our Calgary office is going to be doing the speaking for this session. Enjoy.
Thank you, everybody, for showing up my presentation as well as coming to our SCADAFest. It's nice to see some returning faces. I'll keep this somewhat informal. If there's questions as I'm going along, please ask. And we'll do our best. I'll do my best to answer. Sometimes I'll defer it off to later if I know I'm going to touch on it. Sometimes it might be a topic that I just can't get into without being able to finish my presentation. So in that case, maybe we could bring it up later on in the week. You could meet me in the developers den and we could talk about something. So, but absolutely feel free to ask any questions you might have. Okay, so if any of you guys sat in on my presentations last year, you might see this being familiar. I use a presentation layer I created in VTScada, and I build my presentations out of the product. So if I have a calculations and expression seminar tomorrow, so if anyone attends that, that one's a little bit more interactive where I can change things, and I'm actually drawing the calculations on the screen and the values. So just to let you know some of the stuff you can do with the product, how flexible it is. Okay, and like I said, please feel free to ask some questions. So I will be showing some demos. It's not just talking. I'll be opening up the tag browser and showing you some of the some tag templates. We'll build some tag types up. I'll show you some things of not to do, some things of how best we would do something. And hopefully I've learned something through the years, through building some of these and running into issues that I'll be able to maybe prevent you from making the same errors I made in the past. Okay, so we will get started then with what is a tag type? And it's a very broad statement. If you open up your tag browser, and the quickest way to look at that is if I click on filter and I select all tags here, I get a little bit too quick. I get a list of all the different tag types in VTScada. So just to make it clear, I'm sure some of you may not have created tag types, but we'll see how to do it. But when you do create your own tag types in VTScada, you're not creating anything that's any different than the tag types that we ship with the product. Okay, so for the most part, these are more complicated. When you think of a driver, that's a tag type. There's a whole lot of code in a driver that goes out and communicates and decodes the protocols back and forth. But at its very core, it's the same type of module. It does the same type of operations. It's just that one's a little bit more basic, and it doesn't have all of the features that the other tag type might have. But by creating these tag types, you're creating the exact same thing that we ship and use with the product every day. So in the scope of our presentation, what we think of a tag type typically is you're building a collection of tags that represents a physical piece of equipment. Let's say that's a good example. In my presentation here, we'll be using pumps extensively in a site. It's the easiest thing to represent. It's probably the most used tag type that you would have. So in that case, you'd have a site. You may have some pumps on the site. And let's say you're looking at your pump. Maybe you have your pump speed, temperature, the flow on the pump, whether it's running or not. So there's 4 tags I can think of offhand for a pump. If you can find some similarities between those, rather than create those 4 tags for every pump in your system, we call these tag types, where you create a new tag type, and when you load one of those up, those 4 tags, we call them child tags, they are automatically instantiated. Fancy word for we start that tag in the system. Okay, so if you get a new pump on board, you don't have to create 4. You create 1 pump, and then all those children for that pump get added automatically. Okay, we'll see some examples of that stuff. I'll get into some of these things down below. So typically, it's a collection of child tags in the context of what we'll be talking about. Just to let you know, and in my last presentation, I showed people how to use this. You can also create simple tag types that don't have children at all. They're very basic. They don't have any extra functionality or calculations or any processing in them. The only reason I create those at times is to help organize the hierarchy of my tags in my system. So in the case of, let's say you have a big multiple oil fields, maybe you organize your tags in the hierarchy by country, maybe even continent, country, state, province, region, and then you'd have your oil fields down below that. Now, I know you guys have all seen context. We'll talk about them a little bit further coming up. But at time, and a lot of guys have probably just created these context tags and treat them as folders like a file system. And you'd have a Canada context, and then you'd have maybe an Alberta context, and oil field 7 context, and then all of your oil fields down below that. Okay, the issue with that, what I try to do is when I create that system of hierarchy for all my tags, is I'll generate a tag type for each one of the levels in my hierarchy. So I'd actually create a country tag type. There's no children below it, it's just a context tag that I've converted into a tag type named country. I'd create a province/state tag type. Maybe a different area tag type or a region tag type. And where that comes in handy, again, it's outside the scope of this, but I'd like to, it's involved, is that we have these nice dynamic widgets called tag lists. And you draw a tag list, you say, I want to draw a list of things on the screen. These are the type of things I want to draw, and I want to draw them with this widget. So if you just use basic context tags, it's really hard to get a list of countries within your tag scope and your hierarchy. You don't know what a country is because they're just basic context tags. So if you generate countries as a tag type, now you have the ability in a tag list, let's say, to say, I want a list of all the countries. If you're writing reports, you can say, I want to run a report on all the countries and filter out your list that way. So it's a little bit of metadata to assign to these. You're taking a basic folder and you're adding some additional information to it. So it's very useful to think of tag types without even having children are useful things. Okay, so what are the benefits? Of course, the biggest one is increased efficiency. So if you can create a site with 100 tags by adding one site tag into your system, it's much more efficient than creating a site and adding each one of those tags individually. The next big one that's almost important is if you get your tag type right, every time you create a new instance or a new site based on that tag type, you know exactly what configuration you're going to get. Whereas if you were creating those tags by hand every time, odds are you're creating 100 tags, you're going to have some configuration errors, some typos, you may type the wrong address in somewhere. So for the most part, you're probably going to have some issues where with the tag type, you solve it once, and then you can just keep reusing it, and you're reusing that work you did to test that tag type. And again, reduced maintenance. So let's say you have 100 lift stations, and you realize down the road that I wish I was picking up that piece of information off that lift station. So if you're not using tag types, you have to go into every one of those sites and add that tag to it, whereas if you're using tag types, you can update your type. You can say, I want my site to now read that piece of information I'm interested in. And by doing that one simple action, every site in your system now has that additional I/O tag, and it begins to pull that data from it. Okay, so maintenance can severely be reduced as well, where something that the municipality might think that's not worth the effort at all because it's going to be a day per site. Maybe you're taking a day and a half or less just to update your template, and now you have the across n number of sites you're pulling that information through. Okay, and then quickly, when to use tag types? If we're talking about and again, this stuff I'm going to show some examples. This is my ranting at the initial stage here, but the easiest case to say yes, you should use a tag type is in the case where you have a piece of hardware that's identical from site to site. Where it comes up most often is if a manufacturer produces, let's say, a pump controller, and there's no programming in it or nothing. That's a clear case of let's use a tag type because the I/O mapping is going to be identical in every one of those pump controllers. So you create one, and then you can just keep deploying that pump controller over and over again. Okay, now we're going to see this a little bit more talking. I think the next slide has a demo on it. So the context tag, it's a tag that you can create within your tag hierarchy. And for the most part, it's, like I said before, it's like creating a folder in Windows. So you have your file system, you can create these folders to organize all your files on your PC. So that's its most basic format. But what it also allows you to do, and then you can just leave it that way. It's very fine to have these contexts and just be using context to organize your tags. There's nothing wrong with that. But it does have an additional feature in that once you create your context tag and you add all your children below, the context tag is your building block for a tag type. So that's what everything is based upon when you actually generate and create the tag type. Okay, so when you're building your tag type out, where you usually start is you have to start by, how do you design your tag type? What are you going to do? And if you're just playing with it, it may make sense just to throw some stuff up, see how it works. But when you're actually starting to deploy and build your types, if you take time up front to properly design it, it's going to last a lot longer, and it's probably going to be open to more changes from site to site. I'll talk about sites a lot because it's typically what we'll represent. But a good design will help you accommodate differences in your site as you're deploying your system down the road. And what do I say by design here is the biggest piece with tag types is you're really going to have to, it's important to get an I/O map of what you're going to be reading for that site. Okay, so if it's a pump-off controller, it'd be great to have it in Excel and see all your addresses so that you can look at it and compare it to see what does this thing actually do, so you can compare one to the other to see if there's any kind of patterns. Okay, so the patterns you're looking for, the biggest one is your I/O addresses, your registers. So if you can find some sort of pattern on your registers, it's a clear candidate to use a tag type on it. And even if not, we'll see some examples where it's also useful if there's no pattern. And scaling in units, if your scaling is different across everything, as you discover changes between your different sites that you're trying to use a template for, your tag type becomes more difficult to build and more complicated because you're having to handle the differences. Doesn't mean you don't do it, but it's just a simple fact where your handling differences is making things more complicated. Oh, I had a demo there. Let me bring that up. So I have this thing called original site, and we're going to look at this and treat this as we're not looking at levels for some reason in this at all. It's a simplified example. But in this one, we have a site with 3 pumps built into the site. And I'm going to clear my filter here so I can see my tags. So again, these things, as it stands, these are just context tags. So I've not created any types yet. I put all of these tags in the tag browser so we would have something to look at and figure out the pattern. So if I bring up the properties of these, they're all simple context tags. There's no typing going on, okay? Just to keep things clear, I'm not going to be configuring I/O devices and drivers. This is more of hey, it's mostly what you would do in here, just to get through the material. Okay, so having said that, if I look at pump 1, I'll leave them all open. So looking at pump 1, I have these different registers. And as I said, the most important part of getting a tag type right is going to be trying to find a pattern in the register. So if I look at flow here, it's at 40,001. If I start looking at flow on pump 2, it's at 40,101. And if I look at flow on pump 3, 40,201. So I'm starting to see a clear pattern here where, hey, does everything kind of look that way? Where if I look at the running state, it's 1 here, 2 here. Sorry, 1, 101, 201. And my speed is 40,002, 40,102, 40,202. So now I have a guy that built a PLC program, and he thought about things a little bit where he blocked his pumps together, and that allows me to make use of this tag typing and build some nice templates that might work out for us. So there's 2 ways to approach this. I could create a tag type based on the site immediately. And in that case, when I create a site, it launches off every one of these individual tags for me. So the site's responsible for launching, how many do I have here? 5, 15, 16, 17, 18 tags when I create a site. That's one way of doing it. I'm a little bit more programmatical when I look at this stuff, and I say, I could start there, but looking at this, I also see patterns within the pumps itself. So the way I would approach this is I would create a pump tag type first. And a pump tag type launches off my 5 child tags. And then when I create my site template, that one would launch off 3 pump tags. So you can nest these things. One tag type can have another tag type as a child. So instead of having one big bunch of spaghetti, you can have this pump, all these I/O are limited to this pump tag type, and I'm going to load 3 of them within my site. So if anyone's written any bit of code, that's kind of the way you look at code, where you don't want to reproduce your code. You don't want duplicate code doing the same thing over and over again. If you have something doing the same thing over and over again, you create a module, and then you call that module from the different places that you want to do it. And that's the same thing we're doing with this pump here, is we're saying, hey, this pump has everything we need for a pump. We're going to roll this into a pump and just launch 3 of them. Okay, but then we do run into discrepancies and differences between the sites, and we do have mechanisms to deal with that. So we have tag parameters, snapshot expressions, start take conditions, and overrides. There may be more. It's all I could think of putting my presentation together. That's about all that I would touch on to deal with the discrepancies between sites. Because when you think, if you have a large SCADA system, there is no possible way that you're going to have sites that do not have discrepancies. It's not possible, right? So in the case of VTScada, you can't have 2 tags with the same name. So you at least have to be able to give it a different name from site to site so that VTScada will accept it at a very minimum. Okay, so designing our tag type snapshot expressions. We'll have a look at that one first. So I'm not going to modify my example that I have here because I'm going to want to go back to it. And so in order to be able to do that, I'm just going to copy bits of the tags to another spot and work with those so that I continue to have this, this example that I'm working with. So again, my preference here, if I was creating this, would be to create a tag type for each pump. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. I'm going to copy the entire set of pumps here, the entire set of tags. So if I select the pump level, I'm going to select copy, and I'm just going to place it at the root here. I'm going to work with this one. Let me say paste as child. Okay, and if I find it in my list, all right, so this is what we had as a series of addresses. Now, to remember what we had under original, the different pumps have different addressing. And if we look closely, if I compare flow from one pump to flow on another pump, you notice that the difference is 100. So pump 1 has this. You add 100, you get the address for pump 2. You add 100, you get the address for pump 3. So what we're going to do here is we're going to create a parameter on our pump. So a parameter allows the tag to behave a different way. And by behaving a different way, you can accommodate the differences between the different pieces or the different instances of that tag that you're trying to use. Okay, so in order to do that, right now I'm going to bring up the properties of the pump. And if I come into settings here, there's an add button. So I can add a parameter. And the parameter I'm adding, there's no difference between that parameter and the name, area, description, help key that's already in that tag type. So the parameter I'm adding is named base address. You cannot have spaces in here. It's part of, it's generating code in the background, so you have to have one contiguous word. Okay, so I've created this base address, and now to accommodate the different addresses, I know for pump 1 my addresses are correct, but as soon as I try to use this for pump 2, these tags are going to try to read the registers for pump 1. So I'm going to modify those registers. And to do that, I'm going to use what we call a snapshot expression in VTScada. Okay, and snapshot expressions can be assigned to your parameter values. And to access them, you right-click on the parameter. Select Add Parameter Expression, and this dialog pops up allowing you to do that. Okay, so I'm going to begin with 40,001, and I'm going to add base address to my 40,001, because if you remember, the initial address of this was 40,001. And I'm going to click OK. And now I do not get an address because I didn't set the value of base address. I created a parameter, a holding spot, but I didn't type anything in there. So I'm going to bring up my properties again, and I'm going to look at my base address. And for pump 1, I'm going to say this is 0. So now that I've entered my 0, my address actually appears in this case. Okay, so that was flow, and I'm going to quickly do the same thing for the rest of these. Okay, so I think I'm running a little behind. I'm not going to do it for all the tags. We'll assume that it works for all 5 of them, even though I'm just doing it for 4. So now I have my addresses correctly being calculated and set within my tag type. So in order to build a tag type, you have to tell the system what you want to name that tag type. So if you open up the properties, on a context tag, there's a special variable or parameter in that context named type. I'm going to name that one pump assembly, and that's going to be my tag type name. So when I go in my tag browser and filter by tag types, I'm going to see a pump assembly as one of the options there. So I'll click OK. Once I've set that up, I can right-click on my pump, and in the context menu, there's a Create New Type option there. And when you do that, it just says, here are all the generic widgets that are usually used to draw one of these things. So these widgets will all be available to me when I try to draw this pump in the Idea Studio. Okay, so I have my pump 1, and to make sure this works, I'll create a second one. Pump 2. And now pump 2, we have to update something on here. There is a parameter named base address. It's 0 for pump 1, but it should be 100 for pump 2, because if you remember, the addresses are all 100 greater on pump 2. So I'm going to add 100 here, and if you ignore the last 3 because of time, you'll see that on pump 2, actually, I have my 40,101 and my 101, and on pump 1, I still have 40,001. So this allows me to reuse a tag type, and based on the parameters that I set within that, I can accommodate the differences between the instances of that tag type. Okay? Any questions so far? All good? Okay. So that's one way to accommodate differences. The next way we're going to look at is your start condition. So I'm going to make use of the 2 pumps that I already have. And I'm going to create a new context at the root level. And again, I'm creating these context tags. They're the building blocks of all of our tag types. I'll name this site 1. And this one is going to be called demo pump site. Okay, and a pump site is going to have 3 pumps. So I'll just cut these that I've already created and paste them as children. I'll rename this one so it's a little bit more consistent. I'll remove that tags from it. And I've said that this can have up to 3 pumps on it. So I'm going to paste my 3rd pump on there as well. Okay, so I have 3 pumps, and the addresses for pump 3 are not correct because I copied pump 1. So within pump 3, I'm going to have to bring up my properties and change my base address from 0, and on pump 3, the value should be 200. Okay, so now if I look at my site, you can see that these things are all lining up and working out for me. So site 1's still a context. I'm going to create a tag type out of it, but as I said before, a tag type can have other tag types that you created as children. That's a very good way to build things. So similar to what I did with the pump, I'm going to create new type for the pump station. And now I have a station tag that if I create a new instance, I automatically get all those pumps and all the children associated with the pumps. So I wanted to demonstrate what we call start tag conditions. And in this case, what we would try to handle is, let's say you've created this pump and you say, oh, now I have a 3-pump station here, but I only have a 2-pump station over there. I want to reuse my tag. I don't want to create a brand new one to handle a 2 and a 3 pump. So what the start tag condition allows you to do is it allows you to place a condition on some of your children to say the child should start or not. Okay, so again, the start tag condition is something we can make use of. Just like the snapshot expression, it typically looks at a parameter of your tag. So we're going to have to add a parameter to our site tag. And because I've already created a type out of this site, I don't have the ability to add the parameters. But now, once you create your tag types, you can access the parameters and manage those tag types from the Manage Types section. So if you load up the properties of your application and go to the Manage Types section, it'll list off all of the tag types that you have in your application. And from here, you can now create the parameters for your app. So pump assembly is the one I want to change. I'm going to click on Edit, click on Add, and I'm going to create a new parameter that says has pump 3. Okay, and you got to remember to click Apply. That's going to add my parameter to my pump. So, to my site, sorry, not my pump. So now if I open up the properties of site 1, so I do have the has pump 3 parameter as part of that pump now. So what I want to do is make use of the tag start condition so that if someone sets that true, that you have pump 3 will start. If it's not set, then pump 3 won't start. So to access your start condition, again, you right-click on the child. So I'm clicking on the child that I want to modify its behavior, and there's a set start condition setting in here. And there's a VTScada function called true, and it'll evaluate a parameter that you pass through to it. If that parameter is true, it'll return a 1. If it's not, it'll return a 0. So this is going to control if our pump starts or not. Again, I use a backslash to access my parameter that I added, which was called has pump 3. And as soon as I click OK on this, my pump 3 disappears. And before I talk about it, I want to update my type because I don't want to lose that setting. So anytime I make a change to this template, the change is only local. It's an override until I click on the redefine type. So redefine type redefines my type, and now that setting is available across all instances of site that I might have. So if I click on site, there's a little red arrow here, a little red X. The red X means the tag's disabled. It's still in my database. It exists, but it's not been loaded. It's stopped. So in order to load that pump 3, I have to come back into my parameters, and I have to set has pump 3 true. So with what I did, if someone did not set that value, it's in a different state called invalid, right? And with true, you get a known state. You get a yes or no. And I'm just not sure right now why that didn't work. I'll have to play with it to see. I just assumed it was going to work its way through. Another way I could handle that, if I wanted to handle that invalid state, is we have another function called pick valid. And it'll make its way through to say, if has pump 3 is valid, use it. If it's not valid, use the next one. And that's set to a 1, which is always valid, so it'll default to 1 if someone hasn't set that. So the way start tags works is if your expression is invalid, the tag will, 10 minutes? Okay. The tag will start. So invalid falls to safe, meaning, hey, if you didn't write an expression well and we can't evaluate the expression, it's invalid, the tag will start up. Okay, quick chat on overrides. So the way an override works, so with all of this stuff, you can see that you can make your tag pretty complicated. But if you have a one-off, you have 100 sites and one of them has this really weird thing. I don't see the benefit in making your tag overly complicated with a parameter to handle that one site that has a really weird thing. So in that case, we do have things in VTScada called overrides where if I bring up the property of any child, I can change this from a 1 to, let's say this, in this case, it's 5. I now click OK, and my address for running on this site is now 5. So even if my template gets updated, my override overrides any updates that I have until the point that I remove the override. Okay, so I'm saying whatever you have as your definition, 5 is what it's going to be. So excessive use of overrides, I mean, if you can use parameters, it's a more elegant solution than using overrides. So if you have tons and tons of overrides, it's almost like just adding tags in your database directly, right? You get to the point where, hey, just create your tags, I suppose. But not to mean overrides should be avoided. They're important. There's a lot of time that was put into those to make sure that if your template doesn't exactly conform to what you have, you can make small tweaks around to it and it still will work. You can make use of it. So a lot of people, we teach classes and they want to build the uber site, no overrides whatsoever, and sometimes your site just gets overly complicated where an override would have been a better call in that case. Okay, so redefining tag types. This one you got to be careful with. If you take anything away from the class, this is what you should take away. Some folks will build their system and they have, let's say, 5 sites. And they come into their site here and they say, I want to update my template, so I'm going to come into tripped. No, actually, I'm going to create a new tag in here. And what are we missing? I have flow, speed, temperature. Let's say I have a pressure of some sort. So I update this, and now he says, okay, I'm going to update my pump tag type. I'm going to redefine it from here. When you redefine a tag type, it's going to take everything in that tag type, including the overrides, and it says this is now what your template is. Okay, so you can come into this pump and not realize that someone else made a different override or a different change. You add your change to it, you redefine it, you're getting yours, but you're also getting everything else that anyone else may have assigned as an override to that pump. So what I do is anytime I'm going to change a tag type, I just create a new instance of it in my tag browser. I know it's mine, I know it's fresh, brand new, no one's tweaked it. I make my change, I update the type, and then I just delete it. So I know I'm working from a nice, fresh copy of the tag type. What Excel allows you to do, we can export our entire tag database. I'm sure you guys have seen that, where you export the database, you make changes, import it back in. You can also export your template database. So I won't do it, but I will export it so that we can see what's in it. So to export our template database, you open up your properties, go back again to this manage screen. I'll click on pump assembly. And if I click export here, there's a button to say open file. That'll speed things up for me. Export, save. So this is exporting not all of my tags. It's exporting what happens when I create a pump assembly. So anyways, what will be in the database is a list of all the tags that get loaded when that particular template gets created, when that site gets created. So you can modify your sites from Excel. Okay, so as a pump assembly, there's a sheet for every tag type in VTScada when we export, and if I click on analog status, you'll see your flow, speed, temperature. So I could delete one of these, import this back in. That updates every instance of my pump assembly tag. Well, thank you guys. Appreciate your time.